So what impact does the high unemployment have on the economy? Well, there are social costs and there are economic costs. The social costs on the economy are an increase in crime rate. So for example, when the unemployment rate is high, then people aren't making an income. They can't find a job. And so they tend to resort to more theft, destruction of property, things like that. When people get laid off, we also see an increase in domestic violence as well. Now, the other impact that a high unemployment rate has in terms of social costs is the increased stress it creates on people. So you're worried about losing your job, that stress can have an impact on your health. We see more heart disease, more mental illness, more stress-related illnesses when the unemployment rate is high. Because there's also that risk of being laid off and becoming part of that unemployed, or perpetually being unable to find a job. That can create issues for people, and we also see an uptick in suicides when the unemployment rate is high. So there can be a big cost on society and personally on people's health and well-being. What we're going to focus on for the remainder here is the economic cost. So when we look at the economic cost, we're looking at what is called the GDP gap. The GDP gap is the difference between what our economy could be worth and what it is actually worth. Now, when we talk about what our economy could be worth, we've actually talked about this term before. So if you remember from the previous level, we talked about the idea of potential GDP. Remember, potential GDP was the total value of all final goods and services if we utilized all of our resources. So these are all the factors of production. If we use all of our land and labor and capital, how much could we produce? What would it be worth? So potential GDP is how big the economy could be, essentially if we were at that natural rate or full employment. We're using up all our labor and we're using up all our resources and capital as well. So we want to compare what our economy is actually worth, the size that it is, versus that potential GDP, what it could be. So we have potential GDP and we have actual GDP. And so you can compare the two of them to find the GDP gap. Now, whether you use nominal GDP or real, it doesn't matter as long as your potential and your actual are both in the same terms. So potential GDP and actual GDP both need to be nominal, or potential GDP and actual GDP both need to be real. Okay, you could do it either way. The key here is that it's if we used all of our resources, how big could the economy be versus where are we actually? And when we compare those two, we get a GDP gap. There are two types of GDP gaps. There's a recessionary gap and an expansionary, sometimes called inflationary gap. A recessionary gap is when your actual GDP is less than your potential GDP. So in this case, our economy is not as big as it could be, which means our unemployment rate is high. We're not using all of our labor, so the amount we're producing is less than our potential, and so likely our economy is contracting or in a recession, so we have a recessionary gap. Now, it's also possible that the economy is booming. We're growing, we're doing great, and we actually can't even find enough workers. If you lived in central Alberta in 2005, we were in this boat at that time. We couldn't find enough workers to fill all the jobs. So if you remember back then, we actually changed some of the labor laws in terms of people under 15 being able to work. and some companies weren't able to be open all hours of the day because they couldn't find enough workers. Like the economy was just doing great. We couldn't find enough people to fill all the jobs. In this case, the actual GDP is more than our potential because we have to bring in extra workers. We have to outsource and find more resources, more capital. So the actual GDP is actually bigger than the potential GDP. Now, this can create a problem because if the economy is growing so quickly beyond the resources that we have available, the problem is this creates inflation, right? That increase in demand for all these goods and services makes prices go up. So expansionary or inflationary gaps can be problematic as well. So we're going to talk in later levels about how we can address recessionary gaps and expansionary and inflationary gaps. What can we do about it? How do we boost an economy that's not growing? How do we close that recessionary gap? Or how do we slow down an economy that's growing too fast to lower those prices and close that expansionary or inflationary gap? So this level is about identifying the type of gap, how big it is, and then in the couple levels that we continue on with, we're going to look at how to address those. How do you keep the economy from shrinking or growing too fast? Well, one way to calculate the GDP gap is to use what is called Okune's law. So the challenge with finding the GDP gap on its own, potential minus actual, is, well, how do you figure out what potential is? How do you figure out how big the economy could be if it used all its resources? Well, Okune's law helps us with that. And what it does is it looks at the amount of cyclical unemployment. Because remember, if we're using all of our resources, then we're at full employment. We have no cyclical unemployment, which means for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, it's increasing the GDP gap. And Okune's law says for every 1% of cyclical unemployment, the size of the GDP gap will increase 2.5%. So we actually have this formula here for the GDP gap. The GDP gap equals 2.5 times cyclical unemployment times our actual GDP. Now remember, our actual GDP can be in real or nominal terms. So let's look at how we would calculate calculate the GDP gap. So we need to know cyclical unemployment. And to find that, we need to know the current unemployment rate. And we need to know what do we consider in Canada to be full employment. That is, what is that natural rate? Remember, the OECD says anywhere between 4 and 6.4%. The reason the OECD gives a range is because different countries have different definitions of what it means to be in the labor force. Remember, we talked about the difference between Canada and the US, for example, leads to Canada having a 1% higher unemployment rate just by definition. So that means that our natural unemployment rate is going to be higher in Canada than it will be in the US, which is why you have this 4 to 6.4% range. So for this particular calculation, let's assume that full employment is 6%. And we know the unemployment rate right now is 6.2%. The other thing we need is a measure of actual GDP. How big is our gross domestic product? So let's go back to Stats Canada. Okay, let's go back to the main page on Stats Canada's website. All right, and we're going to go into this real GDP by expenditures. And if we go down here, a number of them will give you real GDP. The first one will give you nominal GDP, so let's just pull that one. So if we look at second quarter 2017, nominal GDP, it's $2.1 trillion. Okay, so let's take that number, 2126408. 2126408. Is that it? 408? Let's just double check here. 2,126,408. Okay. And of course, that's got a couple zeros extra to add here. So that's hundreds, that's thousands, millions, billions, trillions. Okay, so that's our nominal GDP. So to find the GDP gap, we take 2.5, and we need our cyclical unemployment. Well, cyclical unemployment is the difference between your unemployment rate and full employment. If your unemployment rate is above full employment, which we have here, of 0.2%, we have 0.2% cyclical unemployment. Okay? If your unemployment rate is below full employment, then you have negative cyclical unemployment, and that'll change what type of gap you have. So this GDP gap is really, if it's a positive gap that you're calculating, it's giving you that recessionary gap because it's saying that we have cyclical unemployment. If your unemployment rate is below your full employment, so your cyclical is negative, the GDP gap you get will be negative, and that's telling you that you actually have an expansionary gap. Okay? So keep that in mind as you're doing the calculation. So we take 2.5 times the cyclical unemployment. Now our cyclical unemployment here is 0.2%. When you do this calculation, you need to put it into decimal form. So if it was 1% cyclical unemployment, it would be 0.01. In this case, it's 0.2%. So we need to make sure we have enough zeros here. And then we multiply it times our actual GDP, which is the $2.1 trillion. All right, so let's do this calculation. We have 2.5 times 0.002 times our 2,126,408. All right, so we do that calculation, and what we end up with, assuming I have the right numbers of zeros here, is 10 billion. $632,040,000. Okay, so 10.6 billion. All right, so our GDP gap is 10.6 billion. What does that tell you? Well, what that tells you is it tells you that if we had full employment, so if we didn't have this cyclical unemployment, we would be making 10.6 billion more in goods and services. So our GDP gap here is that 10.6 billion. We can turn that into a percentage to figure out the percentage of potential GDP lost due to unemployment. So if we take that 10.6 billion and we divide it by our potential GDP, we can figure out the percentage of our potential that we've lost because of the cyclical unemployment. Well, to find potential is going to be equal to our actual plus that GDP gap. So our actual was the 2.1 trillion. So the 2.1 trillion is equal to a 2126 billion. 2126 billion plus the 10.6 billion. And so if we were to find a percentage, we take 10.6 billion and we divide by 2126 billion plus the 10.6, and we multiply it all times 100. And so what we get here is essentially 0.5, 0.5%. So how much potential GDP have we lost due to that unemployment? It's about 0.5%. Now we can look at what's been happening to the GDP gap over time. So for example, in 2013, the GDP gap was about 2%. If you go back further, so you go back to 2011, it was 3.38%. If you look at last year, it was just over 1.5%. So our GDP gap has been falling over time. And this should make sense because the economy wasn't doing very well and has since been improving, so the GDP gap should be disappearing. And what kind of gap do we have? We have a recessionary gap. We know we have a recessionary gap because we have cyclical unemployment. If we didn't have cyclical unemployment, if our unemployment rate was below the full employment rate, then we would actually have an expansionary gap. And what you can see on this graph is you can see some of the years in which we had an expansionary gap and some of the years where we had a recessionary gap.